All right, welcome to another workshop offered by the University of Kentucky and the Office of Work Life. We often provide a variety of workshops for our employees, especially for our working parents. And so today's topic is helping children who experience trauma. And we have Dr. David Weisenhorn with us today as our guest speaker. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you, Zeta. I'm so thankful to be here. I have been on these for several years now and really enjoy getting to talk to people while they eat because they oftentimes they have their mouth full, so they can't ask a lot of questions. No, I'm just teasing. Hopefully the idea today will just be to generate some learning, but also maybe further your idea of wanting to learn more about the topic. I like to give people an understanding of who they're getting that information from. So, with full disclosure, I want to give you an opportunity, and it's an opportunity for me to highlight my family. I am a family scientist at the university. Typically, when I tell people that, I get a furrowed brow. I get a little sign of confusion, and so I like to elaborate a little bit on that. I have my doctorate in family science, and what that means is I study the sociology and psychology of families. I look specifically at what helps families thrive and some of the barriers that keep families from thriving and working towards identifying what those are and if there are factors that we can mitigate, how we would do that. My role here at the university is senior specialist for parenting and child development. And that means I kind of look around the state and go and have talks and present education on what the constituents in each county need as it relates to parenting and child development. And so this would be a talk that would definitely be in my wheelhouse. I'm a U.S. veteran, so I like to put that out there for all the veterans that are here. I also am an instructor and an educator for 24 years, husband for 21 years that just did that this month, actually. My I have been a father for 13 years, and this to me is probably the most staggering statistic that I share in my talks because my daughter is the number 22 there is about to be 14 next month, and that just baffles me at times. I'm a family and individual therapist. I've been doing that for 5 years. I spent time doing that before I came back and got my doctorate and continue to help in the community at times when those times call for it. I've been a researcher for 12 years, and you get to see some of the topics that I like to research. Today, when I share my topic, when I talk, what I'll share with you today is not so much based on my therapeutic experience per se, but more so based on the findings of Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who is a psychiatrist and neuroscientist and has studied trauma for over 50 years. You may have heard of him. He's very published, and one of his greatest, I think, one of his most what I don't know what I call this, maybe the most recognizable uh, publication that he has was a New York Times bestseller called "The Body Keeps a Score." And so a lot of what I share today will come from just a small bit of what he's captured in that book. So if you do find yourself desiring more information, you can simply go and look him up and find more information about him. There's a lot of information about him. He's done a lot of different works. And so I would encourage you to read up on him and his work. So today, to give you a roadmap, so everybody kind of knows where we're going, I want to look at the definition of trauma and how it's evolved over the decades of learning, and then how common trauma is in children, and then talk about the evidence-based, and that's going to be important, the evidence-based treatments that work with children specifically. So as we jump in, we're looking at trauma, and Dr. Bessel van der Kolk discovered that in his early work that most of what we understood or what he understood when he was entering this work came from the early 1940s from World War I veterans. And there was a doctor that he seemed to be very enamored with who was kind of the hot topic. He was the one that seemed to be doing the most research. His name was Dr. Cardiner. And he coined this term called physioneurosis. And he did that in 1941 because what he recognized was that the veterans that he was working with had physical expressions of a psychological pain. And so what he noticed was that the body was actually continuing to experience very frightening and traumatic or terrible situations that kept coming back. And they were coming back in the form of images. They were coming back in specific behaviors that he was recognizing, as well as physical sensations. And the first definition comes back in the DSM-3. And as you can see, let me hold on for a second. I realize sometimes I talk about things that I expect audience members to know. And because I don't know where everybody's from, I want to take a second to say, so the DSM is called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. The reason there's a number after it is representing the version at which we are. Today, we're at the DSM-5. At the time when Vanderkolk was doing the work and Cardiner was looking at veterans, it was the DSM-3. And what that definition was an event that is outside the range of usual human experience. And I think over the time, we realized that that definition might be out of sorts. But in giving that, I want to talk a little bit about what that diagnostic statistical manual is. So it is what every psychiatrist, psychologist, and counselor have in their offices. And when they work with someone, a patient, we can call them, when they work with that person, through their discovery, through this back and forth, they are finding out what are the symptoms that this individual is having. What are the problems that seem to be in the way? And they'll use that DSM to identify certain criteria that are associated with that diagnosis. And in that diagnosis, they often give a background of how many people in the general public actually have this diagnoses, and what are some of the precipitating factors that lead people to those diagnoses, and what are some expected behaviors as a result of that diagnosis. So there's a lot of information that's in the DSM. And so what we're seeing here in the DSM-3 is that at the time that World War I veterans were getting out of war and were experiencing these traumatic events, trauma, we see that at that time, when this definition, it was an event that was outside the range of human or range of usual human experience. And so what we can either gather from this is that that was ignorance on our part, or maybe that was just the beginning of understanding what was happening in our time. And maybe prior to that, we weren't seeing a lot of that. So there's a lot of ways to understand what that is. And so I want to give you a little bit more. So when we talk about trauma, most people say, I've got PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And that was what was in the DSM. And what we know is about 70% of people worldwide will experience a traumatic event in their lifetime. All right, so we'll take that was worldwide. 70% will have a traumatic event. Take it to the US, 61% of men and 51% of women report experiencing at least one traumatic event. However, and this is a big however, if you're tuning in right now, listen to the however. However, most people who go through a traumatic event will not develop PTSD. All right, they will not actually meet the criteria to be diagnosed as someone who has post-traumatic stress disorder. Only about 6 out of every 100 people in the US, said another way, 6% of the US population will have PTSD at some point in their lives. But many people who have PTSD will recover, and that's important because we're talking about a disorder that is reversible or recoverable, let's say that. And so when we think about them having a PTSD and then actually recovering from PTSD, they still become part of that original statistic. So what I'm saying is that at any given time, any given year in the US, only 5%, 5 out of 100 people will actually be given the PTSD diagnosis. So that's not to minimize if children experience a traumatic event, and we're going to talk about trauma and how it goes, but I want that because I think it's important that we not misuse that term and begin maybe making things worse in the sense of saying, oh, we've got PTSD. My son or my daughter has PTSD because they've experienced trauma. Typically, there's other criteria that lead to that diagnosis. Not to say that they won't get that, but just to give you information about how that goes. So we knew here in the DSM-3 that an event that is outside the range of usual human experience, and if you were in front of me, I would ask people if they think that's an appropriate definition. And I think what you would tell me is that, David, it's not, right? 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 20 boys is sexually abused before the age of 18. And that's a 2024 Center for Disease Control and Prevention statistic. 1 in 4 kids experience physical abuse. 1 in 8 kids experience childhood domestic violence. So as you can see here, trauma is not an unusual experience. Matter of fact, it's rather common in our society. Today, trauma is defined as an exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. It's an event that takes place that completely overwhelms you or the child, whoever we're speaking about. But the event is not the trauma. And I wanted to say it, but rather the trauma is how you respond to it. I'm going to say that again. The event is not the trauma, but the trauma is how you respond to it. And that is why I think this can give you some clarity as to why people can respond differently to the same event. 2 people can go to war and one be affected and the other is not affected. And this is because it's how are we responding to it? It's important to note that trauma enters our body through all of our senses. So trauma can be experienced through smelling, through touching, tasting, hearing, right? So we also need to understand if trauma is experienced in that way, we can oftentimes be triggered in those ways. So a child who has experienced trauma might hear something and revert to that trauma, or taste it, or see it. And so it doesn't take the actual event per se of hearing or seeing it. So one, if not the most mitigating factor, so the thing that reduces trauma, right? One of the main factors is who's there when the experience happens. If you're bitten by a dog, and I was as a child, and it's a nasty bite and it's scary, but you have a parent who picks you up, or a loved one, a caretaker who picks you up, calms you down, and takes care of that bite, the foundation of your safety has not been destroyed. However, in the traumatic event that there's not a foundational security, there's not somebody there to do that, the foundation of your safety is not there, right? So there's no calming to that event. And this is what creates the imprint in the brain. And it creates it in that innermost part of the brain called the reptilian brain, right? This is where our fight, flight, or freeze response lives, which is going to continually to communicate to that middle part, that limbic system of the brain that says, hey, it's overriding that piece that says, hey, we're good. I've got people around me that I know. It's saying, no, you're not safe. And in doing that, your brain begins to dump this cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And he dumps that into the system. And this, over a long period of time, is what begins to change the brain. And so that's the lingering effects of trauma. Once that that cortisol is constantly pumping, it changes the brain, and then it continues to react to mild stressors as if they are life in danger. So what I want to say is this is oftentimes what happens in children, and we see that a lot. So if your child or a child in your care has experienced a traumatic event, and a small stressor might be something like being asked to clean their room, and a parent approaches them and says, hey, I want you to clean your room. And that child in the moment may be triggered by something that happened to them in the past. And maybe what they begin to think is this idea of, like, I don't know if I can do it right. What if I do it wrong? What if they get mad at me because I don't do it right? Are they going to hit me? Are they going to leave me? And out of that response becomes that fight, flight, or freeze. Out of that process, comes that fight, flight, or freeze response, where the child might begin kicking and screaming and kind of going into a state of hysterics. They might storm out of your room or out of the house, and threaten to run away or leave the area, or they might just look at you with that 10,000 yard stare as if they're looking through you and they're not quite sure what's going on because they have been triggered and now are in this state of trauma. So how do we help a child that's in that? So there are some treatments because the one of the challenges with treating trauma is trying to figure out how do we live in bodies that don't feel fundamentally safe? How do I live in this body that's constantly telling me I'm in a threat zone, that I need to take care of something? These treatments that we're going to talk about, psychotherapy, which is talk therapy, eye movement desensitization response is also referred to oftentimes as EMDR, yoga in theater and movement. These treatments are evidence-based. And really, in my opinion, and again, that's just my opinion, so I want to state that honestly. I believe these treatments should be researched or explored prior to taking any medication. And I just that would be where I would want people to go because of the results, because of the evidence that shows these, that talks about these, and they oftentimes are in control groups that are compared to over-the-counter medications or psychotropics. So let's talk about talk therapy. There are repeated studies, and I mean several studies that show psychotherapy, this talk therapy, is more effective than medications. And the evidence further suggests that actually adding medication to psychotherapy does not significantly improve the outcome. What's interesting to me is when I worked in therapeutic setting, I did this at a university, at Appalachian State University, and I oftentimes spoke with college students. I also worked in the community mental health services. So I worked not only with just college students, but I worked in the community as well. I had a couple of different jobs that led me to therapy. And what I found was they would always want to take a medication rather than talking about it. And I found that to be really interesting to me, that most people don't want to talk about what happened to them. And one of the most, I guess, most used or recommended psychotherapy is PET, called prolonged exposure therapy, which is called PET therapy. It's oftentimes used, it's used at the VA. A lot of times it's used with veterans, as people that have had very traumatic events. And the idea is that the client gets to tell their story over and over and over until there's no longer fear in it. And the arguments that seem, or the criticisms of this therapy is one that we might always believe too. And then I felt like a lot of times my clients would approach me with is this idea that, man, why would you want me to relive that trauma over and over? The reality is, I don't know how many of you are moviegoers or really enjoy scary movies. We're coming up on Halloween, so this seemed like it was an appropriate example. When you watch a scary movie, the first few times it really frightens the dickens out of it, right? Especially if you're me. I'm a sissy when it comes to scary movies, and so I would not choose to watch a scary movie. I watched for the I don't know what my audience, where my age is, but that Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger was the scariest individual or the scariest thing, I don't know, and the fact that he'd come to you in your sleep just absolutely scared me to death. But if I continued to watch that, it scares me less and less the more I watch it. And that's really what happens with the retelling of our story, is that it reduces the fear and allows us to separate ourselves from the hurt. I had a traumatic experience when I was young. And I would share this with close friends. I'm not going to get into the experience, but I would share this with just close family and friends. And my wife at one point said, David, I don't really think you should share that. Like, you get very upset when you share it. Like, I noticed that you get upset. And she's right. I would feel the hurt. I would feel my heart rate accelerate. I would get nervous about what was happening. And it would send me into a fight state. But the more I told that story, If I tell you that story today, if I had an opportunity to share it today, you would find that that doesn't bother me at all. And so the retelling of that story is important. But not only is the telling of that story important, but the fact that people don't want to do that is oftentimes an indicator that that's probably the way that we should go. Because when you establish psychotherapy, one of the strongest indicators of a good therapeutic outcome is the relationship that you have with your therapist. And so being able to find someone that you trust and feel that you can allow this relationship, that I can talk about how bad I feel and talk about things like, oh, where do these feelings come from? How long have they been there? Because when we talk about what we've done, when I talk about how I develop these feelings, self-compassion comes from this understanding, this knowing that my reactions are understandable. Maybe not logical. Maybe I realize that I didn't do what I should have done, or I wish I would have done things differently, but they're understandable because we understand that more. And that allows for that self-compassion, which opens the door to that healing. The second one I want to talk about is the EMDR, the eye movement desensitization responsiveness. And this is a psychotherapy that is a technique that helps people process trauma memories through the distressing, through the movement of their eyes. And there's a lot of lights, and oftentimes a therapist. So the EMDR involves moving eyes in a specific manner. Oftentimes the patient is focusing on a therapist's finger or flashing lights. And as he talks about the memories, there's something that's happening inside and it really seems like a mystery. But the goal is to help the patient understand the trauma and change the way that they feel based on the memories stored in the brain. So I'm getting to change some of the memories, and through the use of lights and bilateral movements. So I talk about bilateral movements. That's important. When you think about, if you stood up and traced a line from the top of your head in the middle, down your nose, and through between both legs, what you would find is that that's kind of the absolute middle. And if I take my right hand and I reach across and I touch my left knee or my left shoulder, that's a bilateral movement. I'm crossing the middle line. And so I'm crossing into the other section. There's something about bilateral movements that help massage the brain. It works the brain, the message from the amygdala releases into that prefrontal cortex. And so there's something about that movement that helps us massage and work out trauma. And I think if you want to think back, this is about childhood games. A lot of patty cake was bilateral movements. You think about sporting events, basketball is a bilateral movement. There are a lot of inventions, and I'm not trying to take away from EMDR, but I'm trying to latch on to something that I think is important in that process is that bilateral movement. Um, Another really interesting case study was looking at the way that respondents from September 11th who lived uh, in Brooklyn, who lived downtown, who lived in New York when the towers came down, the subways were shut down. And there's this amazing photo. It's one that's etched in my mind. And it was a picture of the Brooklyn Bridge, and there's just tens of thousands of people shoulder to shoulder, and they're walking home. They're walking across the bridge. What was interesting about that is they said that in the amount of trauma that was the traumatic event that took place, the need for therapists was the lowest they had ever seen in such a large event. And they attributed much of that to the bilateral movements of those people walking home across the bridge, talking with someone else who shared in a similar experience. So in two ways, I feel like that example is taking the EMDR, the bilateral movements, as well as that talk therapy, and putting them together. And what we saw a lot of work that was being done without the need of somebody who is a professional. The third one I'll talk about here, that again is evidence-based, is yoga. This for those, I feel certain that everybody in the audience knows what yoga is, but this is that connection of the mind, body, spirit. And what was interesting about the work that Vandekopf was talking about, and the title gives it away. The body keeps a score. That trauma is oftentimes stored in the body. And when we can connect our mind to the body, we begin to acknowledge and work on that inner sensory system. We're forming that relationship between me and what's happening in my body. And so much of that is increasing this relationship, but also is forging a sense of safe community, because yoga is rarely done alone. You can do that, but you can go to studios, as you see this picture here with children. There's a lot of children there. We incorporate some yoga into the kids programs that we do through Extension for just this very thing, this very reason, that it helps to draw this sense of safe community, but also draw comfort and support through understanding this relationship with ourselves. And it's really important that I put that all studies using yoga show better results than all pharmacological study results. So it's better than any medication. The final one I'll talk about, and then I think we have time at this point to open up after this, is theater and movement. So very similar to the yoga, and I think to the EMDR. What we're seeing here is that there's a physical component to working through trauma. There's a body piece that has to be incorporated, I think, to have really good results. At least 3 of the 4 are showing that. So there's a variety of ways, a variety of methods that include drama therapy, or trauma theater rather, and then this playback theater. But they're all different words given to what I felt like was when I looked into it, very similar in process. And so what we have is that we've got a lot of theater companies that are coming forth to say, hey, I think drama can help you. And the reason that drama, or what we would call oftentimes in young people, is play therapy, this idea that playing different roles in your body can help you understand that we can organize a relationship with ourselves, but understand that we can feel different things based on the position or the role in which we play. And so the results that were found from this is that it helps. What they found through this drama or theatrical performances is that it helps regulate emotions, that it builds coping skills, it helps them explore their inner experience, and rehearsing healthy behaviors tended to be very important to them. And they would even look at like ways in which they might do things different. Many of these drama companies, and like I said, there are big ones now that are working with specifically veterans who have suffered with PTSD and putting these shows on the road. But what's important to note, I think, is that these aren't always done, like theater and movement, they're not always done in front of a live audience. It's not that people come and witness a child who's dealing with their trauma or stress of that, but rather these are private sessions, not public. They're not made for an audience. However, there are some, and that's what I was trying to get to, is that there are some that are showing the more adult side of that, that are taking this on the road to show audiences the effects of trauma. And I think that's an important piece, but that's not exactly what I was talking about here. Most of what we would do or would be conducted with children is that they would be doing this in a private setting, that they would have the opportunity to role play different pieces and to learn how to cope with some of those things. So I've shared a good bit today, and I'm again, I want to make sure that you stay within your time. I know this was a lunch special, so hopefully I've given you something to consider. I'd love to ask or have any questions at this time. Why I do that, though, I'm gonna have this slide for questions, but I want to also share some of the resources that we have here in Extension. And now these aren't specific. I don't, and maybe this is confusing as Zeta, so I want to make sure I don't confuse the audience. These aren't for working with children that have trauma. These are just some of the Extension resources. I do have I'll go to this This was just the bit of resources that I have. If you're interested, this is some information that I used in this presentation that I think is really good and important information if you don't know where to go to learn more about the topic. I'll open it up for questions now.
Are there any questions? You're welcome to type it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask your question.
Heard that The Body Meets the Score is a fantastic book. I was just wondering if you knew where the best place to get it would be, specifically at not a crazy price.
And not a what?
Crazy price.
At a crazy price. What's it? I try to find used books, so I go online and buy them used, but
Right.
I rarely buy new books. I would bet most of the libraries, public libraries in town hold this. So I would try that first. I think that would be a good spot. If you can get it for free, I would do that. You might even try to go on to YouTube and see if there's either a reading of it or ways in which they can get videos of it. So you might be able to get an audio book of it. A lot of times what I found with YouTube is they'll have people who read their books there. So thank you.
That's a great tip for how to find this book. Any other questions or comments even?
Yeah, as I say, Barbara, I'd love to know what you found. Was it interesting? Yeah, Young Library has a physical copy. So if you're here at UK and you're on campus, you can swing by Young Library. It looks like has a copy. Thank you, Adrian.
Hi, this is Barbara. I just thought the topic of this was interesting, so that's why I'm here. It has nothing to do with my work. But as I was listening to you, I do have some neighbor children that I've interacted with, and it kind of gives me a little bit of insight into their behavior because I
Mhm.
know they had trauma. Um, there's several adopted children who have a history. So yeah, I'm relating
Barbara,
it to things.
one of the things that I think is really interesting in it's I think what makes trauma difficult with young children is the process where trauma is stored in our all of our brains is in that reptilian brain, right? It's in that inner piece, and the hope is that we're going to massage that into the prefrontal cortex, which allows us to kind of process that. The hardest part with children is that prefrontal cortex is just in those early stages, especially depending on the age of the child, of development. And so a
Mhm.
lot of times the treatments are so one off because of the age of the child. It's very difficult to determine at where their prefrontal cortex is. I mean, there's questions now of even thinking about when that thing is fully formed, right? We say we heard early 20s and then we heard 25 and now they're saying it might not be until 30. I joke sometimes and say my wife still doesn't think it's done and I'm at 47. So you never, I think that the crux of talking about this topic for me that gave me some nerves is just that I think we all are an N of one. We are so unique that it is difficult to determine just what the most effective method of treatment is. But I do see throughout looking at the evidence-based treatments that it seems to be the ones that involve movement and involve expression, whether that's a verbal expression, whether that's a physical expression. And when you can create a combination of those, it seems like that offers the most success for children. And so a real opportunity to talk to a young person that's having that kind of reaction, it might just be that steady return to those questions. How are you today? And just showing that safe space. Because I think when we talk about talk therapy and the how do we connect to a therapist, it's always about that connection, right? What's that? what's that relationship like? And that's so important for young people to have a place where they feel safe. So even as a neighbor, you could be a great resource for them just as a safe individual in their life, you know?
Yeah, well, I try, and they come over and they know that my standard question is, "What did you learn today?" That just opens the door. You know, how was school? How was it? Because I told them my grandfather said you have to learn something new every day. Could be small, could be about somebody, but
Yeah.
that's the opening. So yeah, I
Well,
enjoy
I
this. Thank
appreciate
you.
you. Thank you. I appreciate you. Thank you. Yeah, Cindy, I appreciate your comment. I too am surprised. Sad. Somebody said they were going to share this with their peds neurosurgery team. All right. Thank you, Katie.
I just wanted to say that I enjoyed that the fact that you shared your personal opinion, stating that you would rather do the EDM and all those eye movement before you move to the medication part, because a lot of people tend to think that medication is the fix before trying other things for the children, and it's sad.
Yeah, what's interesting about that, when my daughter was born, the doctor asked, he said, do you plan to breastfeed? Of course, he was asking my wife. It would be a silly question if he was asking me. And I said, yes, we want to breastfeed. And he said, do not introduce your daughter to the bottle until you're ready to stop breastfeeding. And I thought that was an interesting statement. And I said, why is that? And he said, because it's so much easier to draw from a bottle than it is from the breast. But the breast is so much more, and we know this in a lot of ways, so much healthier, especially if the mom is healthy. There's a real need for that, right? But I think in his explanation, just a simple explanation, I think it goes back to why I think most people want to take medication because it seems to be an easier route, right? We are programmed, even as a baby, to take the path of least resistance. And I just think that's really powerful for people to realize that, man, sometimes the tough way is the right way. And medication, while it does alleviate, and there's a lot of studies that look at medication, but I think it often has become in our society the first step when I think there are better first steps. I would use it as a last resort, especially on young children, especially with a developing brain. Um, Not everything is known. Again, I'll go back to we are all very unique. How happens to you, may not happen to me. We can do the same thing and have very different experiences. And so I just believe that that's important when we talk about medication too, is like, I'm going to ingest something into my body. And maybe my body works a little bit different than the people who were in those studies that we had those. And so if we can do something first that would be much safer and shown to be helpful, that's what I would really suggest. Thank you for your comment. I'm so glad you're here, Tania. If you're still here, if you want to comment or share from your knowledge, I would love to hear from you. I'm glad you found it helpful. I'll say that, and I really appreciate your work working with teenagers who are dealing with gun violence and trauma. That's wow, that's honorable work. Thank you, and difficult work. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you for having me. I just wanted to say real quick, I agree with everything that you're saying. I love to hear that the talk therapy is actually something that helps, that's actually a form of evidence-based treatment. So that was very good to hear because I believe that these safe spaces are working. We can tell just based on some of the other data. I worked through One Lexington, contract through One Lexington to do some work. So to hear that some of these treatments are what we're doing and that it's working is a good thing to hear. But also to hear some of the other options that are out there and why it works. So thank you. It was good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, and I would recommend Jason Wilson is an author. He's well known. He's wrote Cry Like a Man. He's written there's another book that another bestseller. Just an amazing man, and he talks a lot. I was just thinking about your audience. He deals a lot with young African American boys who are living in Detroit and in New York, and he works with. Yeah, that's it. It's that book is amazing. I just got a chance to meet him 2 weeks ago. An amazing person, got a big heart. His book is really powerful. He grew up in a very traumatic home and lost his brother to gun violence. His mother was physically abused. I mean, it really is. And he comes out with such great evidence, and he works with a lot of boys and their parents in that very same way. He uses martial arts, but it was a more a unique form of martial art that he uses. But that might be of value to you. That's all I share. That's the only reason that I would share that with you, because that might be of value. And thank you again for the work that you do.
Thank you.
All right, are there any other comments or questions?
I'd love for more. I feel like this is the best part of any presentation is when people have feedback. So I would love that. Because I mean, even now we've just had so many different conversations that weren't a part of the learning experience, but or what was intended for the audience, but there's still a lot of learning for it. So I love the questions. I love the comments. I'd love to hear how why this work interests you. If you want to even just share that. So many people just said, "Hey, this isn't the work that I'm doing, but I had an interest. I see people in my neighborhood, whatever." I would love to hear more from you.
I actually have another question.
Thank you.
Is there a way to get your, I don't, get your resources? I was trying to copy and paste the resources on your last slide into my email, but it won't let me do that.
Zeta, is there a way you can get those?
Yes,
Can you get
I'll
those
be able,
in the chat?
not in the chat, I don't believe. I don't think I can copy it while you're sharing, but
I was gonna say, you know what? I'm just gonna try and let's see if I can drop them in.
yeah, you might be able to. But yeah, if
And
you
then,
send me your presentation and then I can pull it out
Oh,
that
I
way.
dropped them in there. There's a lot in that. So I apologize if that's more than you wanted. Was that Katrina? Is that right?
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah, thank you for that.
you just put them in the chat?
I did. I dropped them in there. Do you see them?
No.
Okay. Well, it may not have worked then. I apologize. Yeah, I think I've gotten too. It's telling me I got too many words in there. So
I'll send it in the post. I'll send it in the post email.
okay.
I was gonna say I'm a first year MSW student at UK, and I have to find a placement for my practicum, and I'm really interested in working with children. So just take like definitely an eye opener. You know, now I kind of understand what I want to do a little bit based on what you just presented.
Wow. Thank you. Well, I think that's wonderful. And maybe you could speak with was it Tanny or Tanya, who was just on here just a second ago. She would be a great one. Maybe she has an opportunity for you.
Hi, it's Tanya.
Tanya, I'm sorry. I was
That's
scrolling up.
okay.
I was like, ah, I just did that.
You
I
you
apologize.
are not alone. I promise you are not alone.
Hey, I've got one of those last names too. I've been called everything you can imagine, you know. I apologize about that. I do.
That's okay. But yes, that young lady, you can, I'll put my email in there if you want to reach out. Like I said, I do contract work with One Lexington, and we actually have a summer program that I am the lead for, and we're looking for volunteers. And we talked about doing a partnership with UK so that maybe they could use it for their practicum. So I can put my email in there if you're interested. I'm not sure what age group the summer program is for teenagers, middle school and high school, but you said children. I don't know. Some people like to work with elementary age kids. So just let me know what age group and maybe I can help.
Yes, you can share your email and I will get in contact with you and we can talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is great. Contacts being made,
I know. Wow, that's
information
the
being
point.
shared.
What we wanted, right? It's
That's
the
right.
point of this whole thing, right?
Yeah. Uh,
Um,
Any other comments or questions from anyone? Oh, I see someone put something in the chat.
yeah, I did too. Zena, do you know of any resources of particular activities, games that people have found successful in working with groups of young people, role-playing scenarios? Yeah, you know what? Gosh, I can't remember. I hate that I don't remember her name. It'll come to me. There was a therapist that used to do a lot of family work, and I thought it was really, really awesome. And what she would do would she would take families and then she would reassign the roles in that family. And so just hear me out before, because I want you to hear what I'm saying. So she would reassign that role. So maybe we'll take a scenario of a family of four. You've got two parents, two children, and maybe one of the children in there is experiencing a difficult time, right? So what they would do is they would ask the child that was having a difficult time, what other person do they want to be in their family? Let's try it. We're going to mix the roles up. What do you want to be? And she would take the roles and they would mix the roles, and then they would get to role play a basic scenario. So, okay, you're at dinner and maybe it's time for homework or whatever. And then whoever those roles are, the parents would then begin to address the conversation, and who the parents oftentimes played the children and the children oftentimes played the parents. And so what happened is it really gives the unique perspective of how that person is experiencing the other. So a child is then being all mean and demanding, like maybe dad or mom does, or maybe name calling or whatever the issue is, might be redirecting. And so then the parent gets to be the child and express how they then see themselves. And the end is that everybody gets to play everybody else's role. And then you go back to your own roles and you get to talk about what that experience was like. How did you experience yourself through mom's eyes? How did you experience yourself through your brother's eyes? How did you experience, right? So you're gathering this information of how the people around me perceive my being. How am I in place and time? Because oftentimes as children, we don't see that. They take everybody experiences the same thing. And we know that they've got a very self-centered role in that. And so they expect that other people understand them when they are talking. And sometimes they use very vague terms. My children do this to me all the time. I'm like, man, I feel like I came halfway into your conversation. I have no idea. Give me some more context because I don't know who you're talking about. And they would get so frustrated as if I should have known who these people were they were referring to, or this event that took place, because their mind assumes that everybody is seeing and feeling the same way they are. And so it really is helpful to help in that role-playing scenario to do that. If you don't have a family context, another thing that I would suggest in doing is that when you talk to students, if they are having very stressful situations, go for a walk. Take a tennis ball, and just say, hey, let's just bounce this ball back and forth to each other while we're talking, because guess what? We're engaging in bilateral movements. So I can take a ball, or they can just dribble a basketball. We're going to both dribble a basketball. We're going to work on our handles, right? So we can just dribble basketballs back and forth, but the basketball is not going to dribble with one hand like this. I can't tell if you guys can see me or not. I'm not dribbling one hand. I've got to cross the lateral, right? I've got to cross that centerpiece. So I've got to dribble from one hand to the other, right? If it's girls, I mean, the old games of patty cake, I mean, really and truly, when we used to be kids, the reason maybe trauma didn't surface as often is because much of what we did physically throughout the day helped in that process of working out our bodies and engaging our bodies in our experiences. I hope that was helpful. Thank you for the comment here, and I hate to do this, but I'm going to work on trying to pronounce your name, Timidiayo. I thank you for that. If that was wrong, I do apologize.
All right. Well, it appears we don't have any additional questions. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This
Thank you,
has
Cindy.
been
Yeah, thank you all so
absolutely
much.
wonderful.